Greetings, family. Welcome to the African Exodus show. This is the Conspiracy to Erase a Nation segment. This was an unplanned video. I literally just decided, oh, I'm going to have to do this video because I wanted to just touch on something that I didn't really get into enough detail, I feel like, inside of the last video that I did for this segment. And given a couple of comments that I've gotten, I feel like it's worth going into more details. So the last video was about the Jewish involvement inside of the transatlantic slave trade, particularly the Sephardic Jewish involvement. Now, obviously, you can't always differentiate the Sephardic from the Ashkenazi involvement. Particularly inside of Amsterdam, you see that there was an influx of both Sephardic Jews, but there was also later on an influx of Ashkenazi Jews. So you can't necessarily differentiate them. The major way that we pretty much can differentiate them is by noting that they are of Spanish origin, or also by noting that they had his Spanish names. You know, that's basically the way that it's differentiated in history, at least. Rarely is there a effort to go out of the way and label a person practicing Judaism as Sephardic or Ashkenazi, right? But I did want to touch on this because I see some debate, and I was aware that there is probably the majority view inside of the Hebrew Israelite movement is that essentially we are descendants of Sephardic Jews, we being people of African descent, particularly from the transatlantic slave trade, or the descendants of Sephardic Jews. Now, I was aware that that was the majority consensus. However, my understanding or my assumption has always been that people who held that view have a belief that there's a separation between Sephardic Jews who are of African descent and the ones who basically are the dominant culture now, but also the ones who went throughout Europe, you know, during the Inquisition. They weren't just driven into Africa. That's an important thing to emphasize. They were driven in Africa, but they were also driven to Europe. And you can follow that migration throughout the European history. So I always thought that, okay, people who hold this belief must hold the belief that there is a separation between these two groups. However, I'm kind of getting the impression that some people think that all people who were Sephardic Jews were essentially the people who we come from. So that's, to me, a huge historical blunder. And it's one that I just can't go on to the next subject without at least giving a more detailed analysis, and also giving you the sources. Usually, you know, when it comes to this segment, because every source that I cite is inside of the book, I don't go out of my way to necessarily show this is what this came from, this is where this came from, this is where this came from, because ultimately I look at YouTube videos as, okay, this is an introduction to what I've spoken about, but I'm not going to go into detail that I would, because writing, to me, like reading something in a book, far surpasses watching something on YouTube. And so I would not want to cheat the person watching into thinking that they're an expert on something without giving them the chance to actually see something in writing, give it their analysis, their thoughts, and then follow the sources. And a lot of times people, I think, are comfortable relying on YouTube videos without seeing a source or having a written and well thought out argument presented to them. So that was really the big reason that I felt like, okay, I have to write a book as opposed to doing YouTube videos. I wanted to give you all the full explanation as far as what I've discovered. Now, that being the case, though, I feel like in this situation, understanding now that, okay, some people don't understand that there's a pretty well-founded history of the Sephardic Jews inside of this role, I felt like it was important to go into more details. Now, if you still end out on that side of, no, I'm still sticking to that thought process that basically all people who throughout history have been Sephardic Jews are the people who are from the tribes of Yasharel, you know, that's your choice. I mean, I'm also going to have a final video on this subject on Monday, and I state inside of the final video, like, listen, I really don't have a strong feeling on what ideology or what doctrine or what argument of mine you agree or disagree with outside of whether or not you accept Yahushua HaMashiach, or some people call him Jesus Christ, as being the Messiah. That is the one that's going to be more important than anything else I talk about on this channel. That is the one that is most consequential. And frankly, whenever I die and am at the judgment seat, whether or not you believed that you were Hebrew, whether or not you believed that you were from Ethiopia, that's not going to matter. Whether or not you receive salvation and I get to see you in the afterlife, or in the resurrection rather, that's going to weigh way more as far as, real things that are going to have implications for me and for you. So that is my major concern. All these historical things, they are just for me to give you more perspective on how things transpired the way that it transpired, and also the facts as far as how I have found them. And you can disagree, you can agree. I'm not sensitive about people disagreeing on this channel. I actually encourage you, if you disagree, to talk it out. I like to go back and forth. I get kind of discouraged whenever someone will say I disagree, and then you respond to them and then they just don't respond. Like, no, let's talk this out. The Bible says, let's prove all things. I don't have a monopoly on information. I'm not an expert in all things. So by all means, if you think I'm wrong, let's talk it out and let's come to the proper conclusion, or let's agree to disagree. I don't think there's anything wrong with that either. So before I even get into just the sources that I want to talk about, I do want to give just some space to Dr. Tony Martin, who really gave up his career for this exact subject. And from here on out, I'm going to use code words. So we'll just say the Ish people from Spain from here on out, or from because they are from Khazaria, whichever one. But Dr. Tony Martin, he really gave his career to completely give everyone a roadmap of how the Ish people were heavily involved in the slave trade. So I want to go to him first because his book and him as a source, he's not going to be accepted in the mainstream. I'm going to give you sources that are more accepted in the mainstream as a contrast, but him as an academic, as a historian, he's not been accepted because of the fact that this is a narrative that they have tried to hide, really tried to hide. I was not aware of it. I'm sure most of you did not learn this in school. If you're aware of it, you probably found out from people who are not beloved in the mainstream, such as Dr. Tony Martin or Farrakhan or people like that. So he really gave his career for this truth and putting it out there and publishing it. And so I think it's important to just hear what he has to say on this subject starting out. So this is his book. I encourage you all to get it, The Jewish Onslaught, Dispatches from the Wesley Battlefront. But we're going to go to a lecture of his. I actually have a different part of this lecture that I've played at the end of my videos where he talks about the origin of the Hamitic myth, which, if you don't know, comes from the Talmud. But he right here is going to give just a bit of information about the involvement of Ish people inside of the transatlantic slave trade. So let's listen to him.
Which had been floating around Europe, and it was seized upon then by the slave traders, Jews and Gentiles alike, as a basic rationale. There were other areas, in which the Jewish presence was very manifest. For example, although I don't know a whole lot about this aspect of it, but my understanding is that Jews were in fact very prominent as slave traders, in the centuries prior to the beginning of the Atlantic slave trade. My understanding is that Jews, for many years sold Muslim slaves to Christians and sold Christian slaves to Muslims, and they were sort of accepted as the slave middlemen by both sides. And this is, a long time before the Atlantic slave trade came about. The earliest multinational corporation involved in the Atlantic slave trade was something called the Dutch West India Company. And again, it often surprises people to discover that even in this early period, globalization was already a very, fairly entrenched phenomenon. The slave trade was a great example of globalization. Here you had the Dutch West India Company, out of Holland, of course, which went to West Africa. They had their own private army. They established forts on the West African coast. They had their own fleet of ships and so on. They had their own administrators. Sometimes they would govern areas. They had their own governors, administrators, and whatnot. They were almost like it was almost like colonization, via private enterprise. It was like privatized colonization, and all of this, of course, transpired with the sanction of European governments. These were like surrogate governments almost. These chartered companies, as they were often called. So the Dutch West India Company in the 1600s then was the pioneer in this kind of multinational, globalized prosecution of the slave trade. And apparently a large number of the shareholders, stockholders in this Dutch West India Company were Jews. The Jews had been chased out of Portugal and Spain. They had been chased out of all kinds of places. They found some respite from their wanderings in Holland. They became an influential factor in Holland. And I've seen a variety of figures. This too is an area of some controversy. I've seen estimates varying from 25% to 50% concerning the stake of Jewish stockholders in the Dutch West India Company.
Okay, so let me just pause real quick because this is something I hit on, but like I said, I didn't go into too much detail inside of the previous video, but this is something I hit on before, that when the expulsion happened from Portugal, again, not everyone went into Africa. There's some that did go into Africa, but a lot actually went into different European countries. And one of the European countries, like I said inside of the video, well, first of all, let's talk about Portugal. There's people in Portugal, ish people who actually converted to Christianity. There's some who did go back to practicing Judaism later on, but a lot of them maintain the identity of being Christians. And that's important to emphasize because what you see happen later on is that the Pope is going to bless this transatlantic slave trade. He's literally, I'll try to find it in the one source because I was reading it earlier. Literally, before they go back, and while they're in Portugal, before they make their voyage to Africa, the Pope literally comes to bless this slave trade. But these people are identified as Christian. Now, you can see how this muddies the waters. If there was a mass conversion of Ish people who were going to convert to Christianity and others who are going to maintain the religion of Judaism. Now, those who maintain the religion of Judaism are going to be expelled from Portugal and Spain. Those who receive the religion of Christianity from here on out, as long as they're practicing Christianity on the historical record, and again, many of them did convert in Portugal and in Spain. Those who receive the religion of Christianity are going to be, as far as the history books, now considered Christians. And of course, they're called new Christians as far as the first generation, but what can you expect is going to happen in the second generation, the third generation over time? Well, they will just be considered Christians. So when you hear about Christians going into Africa to do this transatlantic slave trade, we have to have nuance and understand that being a Christian does not necessarily mean that you are divorced from the previous reality of the fact that you were previously considered a Ish person, okay? Now, that being the case, though, he hits on a very important thing that I want to emphasize. So as he said, from Portugal, they get expelled into different places in the world. Some go into Africa, some go back, and some go into the so-called Middle East, but many also go into Europe. And the place, as I said in the last video, where basically the biggest community of Ish people from Spain, where they take as their new habitation is going to be Amsterdam, right? And so how interesting that the Dutch West Indian Company is going to come out of this same community. So that's what Dr. Tony Martin is hitting on now, is this new community that is in Amsterdam, and the fact that you're going to have this massive slave trading operation linked to the Dutch West Indian Company that is going to be the authority for that particular period on transatlantic slave trade. So let's go back.
But suffice it to say that they were an important element in the Dutch West India Company, which was the preeminent entity carrying on the slave trade in the early period. The Dutch West India Company was responsible for importing, the earliest slaves to places like Brazil, to some parts of the Caribbean, either directly or indirectly, I think, to this country as well, in a very early period in the 17th century. In many areas in the Americas, Jews were a dominant element in the slave trade. In Brazil, for example, in the 17th century, Jews were a dominant element in the slave trade. They owned a large number of the plantations. They were often very importantly positioned in other aspects, not necessarily the plantation aspects, but things like, say, the importation of slaves, things like the warehousing of slaves, things like the auctioning of slaves, things like the provisioning of slaves, things like manning slave ships, provisioning slave ships. In New England, for example, at the height of the Atlantic slave trade, rum became a major economic venture in New England. Places like Providence, Rhode Island, places like Boston, and so on. And rum was a major factor in the slave trade because rum was one of the major items of trade, one of the major items that slave ships carried when they went to West Africa to trade in exchange for slaves and so on. And I believe that at one point all the rum distilleries in Boston were owned by Jews. I think there was something like 18 or something like that rum distilleries. So in all of these areas, both directly and in terms of ancillary industries feeding the slave trade, Jews were very, very important. Apart from Brazil, Jews were again dominant factors in many other parts of the area. For example, in Curacao, a Dutch island in the Caribbean. The majority of folks involved in the slave trade in Curacao were Jews. At one point in Suriname, which again was a Dutch colony right next to Brazil in South America, Jews were again a very important part of the slave trade in Suriname. There was an English soldier by the name of John Stedman who went to Suriname in the late 1700s as part of a mercenary force raised by the Dutch to try to fight against the maroon slaves. Those were the escaped slaves who established an independent existence in the interior and gave the slave regime a lot of trouble. And Stedman wrote a very fascinating book concerning his experiences in Suriname, and there are several references in Stedman's book to the presence of Jewish slave owners and so on. There was one large plantation area in Suriname called Jew Savannah. Jew Savannah. And according to Stedman, the Jews were very often the most cruel of the slave owners. They played a very prominent role in torturing slaves and so on. He has several little vignettes that he mentions in there concerning the kind of cruelties that were meted out to slaves by both Jewish men and women. There's one case he describes there of a maroon slave leader, a man called Jolicoeur, French Jolicoeur, beautiful heart. Don't know where he got that name from, Jolicoeur. But apparently Jolicoeur, again, was a rebellious slave. He led a slave uprising. And on one occasion, apparently, the Maroons were fighting against, some of these people from Jew Savannah. And according to Stedman, they captured a Jewish slave owner named Schuss. And apparently Schuss was the man that Jolicoeur, the slave owner that Jolicoeur had escaped from as a young boy. And Jolicoeur remembered that this guy Schuss had apparently ravaged his mother and so on. And Stedman describes a very, very, very harsh vengeance that was wrought by Jolicoeur on Schuss. He flayed him, cut his skin off, then used his skin to keep the powder dry, the powder for his cannon or whatever, and used his head to play football with. Jews were also very prominently present in non-Dutch parts of the Caribbean, places like Barbados, places like Jamaica, St. Thomas, and many of the other islands as well. There's been a big debate that has arisen concerning whether Jews were the dominant element or not, or whether they were even an important element. But much of that discussion has taken place in the context of the United States of America. In the U.S., it may not be correct to say that slaves were Jews were as dominant in the slave trade as they were in parts of, say, the Caribbean or Central America. Nevertheless, Jews were an important part of the slave trade in this country, in the US of A, anyway. In fact, in the US of A, Jews apparently played a role in the slave trade that was greater than their numbers in the overall population would suggest. Just as in 1992, a study done based on the Forbes magazine list of the richest people in America for 1992, a study based on that list discovered that something like 33% of the billionaires in the US of A were Jews, based on the Forbes list of 1992, at a time when Jews claimed to be 2.5% of the United States population. So just as in 1992, they were overrepresented in the high echelons of this country, just so during the slave trade, even though their numbers may have been relatively small, and many of the people who have tried to refute the suggestion that Jews were prominently involved in the slave trade in this country, many of those people have put forward figures suggesting that Jews were only a very minute portion of the overall American population. Yes, they were a very small percentage of the American population, but that has nothing to do with their role in the slave trade, the importance of their role. The role was much greater than their numbers in the overall population would suggest. As a matter of fact, a Jewish historian has done a study of the 1830 census in the South and has come up with the conclusion that something like 75% of Jewish households in the South in this country in 1830 owned slaves, whereas the percentage for white households generally was only something like 36%. So the Jews were approximately twice as likely as non-Jews, as the white population, to own slaves in this country in the South in 1830. So again, we're talking here about proportions rather than absolute figures. Some of the most important slave ship owners in colonial America were Jews. Perhaps the best known of these is a man called Aaron Lopez. I noticed that many of these persons had Spanish or Portuguese sounding last names, and that's because they were Sephardic Jews.
Okay, so I want to go back and emphasize this part right here. I hope I don't go too back, but let's emphasize this right here, what he says.
Proportions rather than absolute figures. Some of the most important slave ship owners in colonial America were Jews. Perhaps the best known of these is a man called Aaron Lopez. I noticed that many of these persons had Spanish or Portuguese sounding last names, and that's because they were Sephardic Jews. When this whole question arose, around my involvement in all this, many Jews were heard to say that there were no Jews in America prior to the 1880s. In fact, Nathan Glazer, a very famous academic out of Harvard University, who should know better, he actually wrote that there's no way that Jews could be responsible for the slave trade in America, since there were no Jews here, he said, before 1880. Of course, there were European Jews here in the 19th century before 1880, German Jews and so on. But there were Sephardic Jews here from the very beginning. From the 17th century, there were Sephardic Jews coming in here to New York and later to other places. So hence the Spanish-sounding names like Nunez, names like Lopez, names like Castro, interestingly enough, names like Ferreira, Herrera, Gomez. All of these names, interestingly enough, suggested Jewish origin in colonial times. Somebody was saying to me yesterday, you could usually get a hint of their Jewishness from their first names. It was you, okay. The last name might be Gomez or Nunez or Castro, but the first name might be Jacob or David or something like that. Aaron. So Aaron Lopez was out of Newport, Rhode Island. He was one of the largest slave ship owners in colonial America. This man had a fleet of ships for many years. He sent his ships to West Africa. They traveled from West Africa to the Caribbean, to Barbados, to Jamaica, St. Thomas, places like that. He had members of his family situated in the Caribbean. He had a whole network going on. And he brought slaves back here as well. Many of his slaves helped to build some famous synagogue in Newport, Rhode Island in colonial times.
Okay, so I'm going to stop there. This entire video is on YouTube, and I would definitely make a note to link it inside of the description. And shout out to everyone whenever I say that and I don't remember and you send a comment saying, hey, you forgot to link it. So I'm going to make an effort to link it inside of the description. So what we're going to just turn to really quickly, again, Dr. Tony Martin, not well liked inside of academia. Those people will criticize him. Like I said, he gave his career for what he put out there, but I do encourage you, again, buy his book, check his sources, see if you agree. We're going to go to 3 articles that I cited inside of Conspiracy to Erase a Nation. So this one right here, again, these are more mainstream articles. This is coming from I believe this came from the WashingtonPost.com, but this was published at New York University by Ellie Faber. So the prominent narrative that you'll see from people who are willing to admit to this role inside of the slave trade is that, yes, they were there, but the idea that they were controlling the whole thing is overblown. Now, of course, they weren't controlling the whole thing, right? As Dr. Martin laid out to you all, particularly inside of the Americas. That is where you see a very clear and evident role. And we're going to talk about that as well. But the idea that they're insignificant, that's what people will say, that it's really an insignificant role or insignificant presence. But what we see here is that there's some areas where you just can't deny the presence and you can't make it seem like it's insignificant and non-present. So we're going to read from this article very quickly, right down to here. So this is talking about the resettlement of Jews. Obviously, we know they were going to Amsterdam, they're going to different places. This is what happens with the ones who decide to go to Holland. So it says such precedents included new Christians from Portugal who reverted to Judaism when they settled in Holland during the 1590s. Some brought slaves to Amsterdam, okay, and tried to sell them prior to 1596, the year in which the city's authorities decided to bar the development of a slave market. So let me emphasize this part right here because this is important as far as the dating. So we know that the Spanish Inquisition happens, and essentially the Sephardic Jews are going to be expelled from the country of Spain in 1492, right? In 1497, the Sephardic Jews are expelled from Portugal. Those who do not convert, that's the thing to emphasize, right? This is in the 1590s, okay? Not even, or just about 100 years later, okay? These are Sephardic Jews from Portugal who are called New Christians. Now think about the dating, just 100 years after the Inquisition, who are bringing with them African slaves, and are bringing them to Amsterdam to try to sell them prior to 1596, okay? This is definitely should be a red flag to the idea that the slaves would have been the ones who were Sephardic Jews, because obviously this is not even 100 years later. They are selling enslaved Africans, and again, this is from Portugal. Portugal is the country, if you don't remember, that started off the slave trade. Not even too much longer. 1497, they expel the ones who do not convert, but the ones who convert are allowed to stay. And just a few years later, they start an international slave trade. Let's emphasize this. Others must have owned slaves thereafter, for the city Sephardic congregation made provision for the burial of servants and slaves in its cemetery in a regulation adopted in 1614. Between 1608 and 1621, a handful of ships chartered by Jewish merchants in Amsterdam transported slaves from West Africa to the Americas. And during the second half of the 17th century, Sephardic merchants in the Netherlands played a part in the transit of slaves to Spain's colonies, although the scope of their involvement is unknown. So let's go forward just a little bit more. This is what I want to hit on, because we have to emphasize, as Dr. Tony Martin was saying, the role inside of Brazil, which was very, very, very prominent. So it says, overseas, Jewish settlers became involved in slavery in Holland's colonies, beginning in Brazil. Seized by Dutch West Indian Company from Portugal in 1630, Brazil attracted Jewish settlers in relatively substantial numbers. By the middle of the 1640s, approximately 1,500 Jewish inhabitants resided in the area of northeastern Brazil, controlled by the Dutch, where they established two congregations and employed the first rabbi in the Americas. Their numbers began to decline in 1645 when Portuguese colonists rose in rebellion, raising the specter of a renewed control by Portugal and the return of the Inquisition. 9 years later, in 1654, a Portuguese expeditionary force recaptured Recife, forcing the Dutch to abandon Brazil. When the Dutch left, the remaining Jewish population, approximately 650 in number, also departed, some returning to Holland, others immigrating to Dutch colonies at New Amsterdam or England or Barbados. So while they were in Brazil between 1630 and 1654, a few of the Jewish settlers acquired sugar plantations, mills, and it's entirely reasonable to assume that they consequently employed slave labor. However, their contributions to the sugar industry were far more significant when it came to providing capital, exporting sugar, and advancing credit for slaves. Let's emphasize this part. As creditors, according to the history of the Brazilian Jewish community, they dominated the slave trade. To be sure, all slave imports from Africa were in the hands of the Dutch West Indian Company, which under the terms of its charter held the monopoly to the slave trade. The monopoly to the slave trade. I have to just keep emphasizing these parts. But the company sold the slaves and transported to Brazil at auctions where Jewish purchasers dominated, purchasing slaves and then selling them to plantation owners and others on credit. For the brief time they resided in Brazil, therefore, Jewish settlers were an essential part of the fabric of the slave trade, although the actual number of slaves they might have purchased and then sold as middlemen amounted to a minute fraction of a huge number of Africans brought to Brazil over the course of more than 3 centuries. Okay, so I'm going to read from this article right here. I posted this on my YouTube, but some of you weren't able to access it. But I will put both PDFs inside of my Telegram. If you want to read the whole thing, I encourage you to read the whole thing, because we have to be willing to look at the sources before we talk about them, right? So it says some of the immigrants from Brazil moved northwestward to the Caribbean, where they were soon joined by Jewish and Moreno entrepreneurs from Holland. There were a number of reasons for the upsurge of interest in the Caribbean. By the 1650s, the British island of Barbados made a decisive conversion from tobacco to sugar, as African slaves and a new class of large planters replaced a population of white indentured servants. In 1662, Spain awarded an Jacinto monopoly contract to the Dutch West Indian Company, seeking a non-Portuguese source for African slaves for the Spanish Caribbean colonies. The main Ascientista, I'm sorry for my pronunciations, or monopoly contractor was the Protestant banker Balthazar Comins, and Jews had little to do with the WIC shipments of slaves from Africa. Still, in 1664, the King of Spain appointed Don Manuel de Belmont, as Jew of Spanish origin, his agent general in Amsterdam for the procurement of slaves. And it was I don't know how to pronounce this island correct, Curaçao, I think? Curaçao. It was in Curaçao, which Morenos helped to establish in 1651, that Jews found their main outlet for selling slaves and Dutch manufactured goods along the Spanish Main. For a time, Curaçao became the great entrepart of the Caribbean, trading legally and illegally with Barbados and other rising British and French colonies, as well as with Spanish mainland. In the 18th century, Jews made up about half of the population of Curaçao, as opposed to 1% of the population of New York City, and seem to have been involved mainly in the transshipment of commodities other than slaves to the Spanish colonies. The mainland Spanish colonies never developed true plantation systems. The demand for slaves declined abruptly in the 18th century, since they could not begin to compete with colonies like Jamaica, Saint Dominique, and Brazil, which constituted the heart of the Atlantic slave trade system and which imported their labor directly from Africa. So let's see, I just want to read this last paragraph. The significant point, and again, this is a mainstream perspective, is not that a few Jewish slave dealers changed the course of history, which would have been the same without Jewish slave traders and planters. The significant point is that Jews found the threshold of liberation from second-class status or worse in a region dependent on black slavery. Before turning to the sobering and depressing part of this message, I should stress that even with regard to the Dutch Sephardi sugar trade, we're dealing with a few hundred families. By the 1670s, the Dutch sugar boom had ended, and Britain would soon emerge as the world's greatest sugar importer and slave trading nation. In Barbados, to be sure, there were 54 Jewish households in 1680, but these were not great slave traders or planters. They were mostly the managers of retail shops, money lending firms who owned fewer slaves per household than the non-Jewish residents of Bridgetown. So, like I said, this is a mainstream perspective, but even they have to, and this is David Byron Davis, and this is from the New York Review, and even he has to admit the fact that even though they don't want to minimize it, that this is a very strong factor in the transatlantic slave trade. So I wanted to present to you these sources. What you do with that from here on out, that's, what you do. Prayerfully, if it's of significance to you, prayerfully you take and do your own research, whether these sources or other sources. By all means, continue that journey for yourself. But I just wanted you to understand that this is not a small thing. This is not a small thing in history. This is not something that can be denied or forgotten. It's very important that we understand what happened during the slave trades, whether it's the Arab slave trade or the transatlantic slave trade. So again, this is what I have on this. Like I said, on Monday, I'm going to put out a video already recorded that's going to just touch on the Fulani inside of Africa. But with that, I just thank you all for watching, and y'all rolling. I'll see you in the next video.